By the end of this video, you will have designed your own amigurumi pattern. Hello, it's Thursday! So this week I'm going to take you through all of the steps of designing a pattern, from sketching out your idea through to working out how to stitch it, all the way through to writing up your notes. This guide is intended to help new designers get started with the basics. So because of this, I might be quite specific in some places, but just be aware that once you know the rules, feel free to break them as much as you like. So I will be focusing on continuous spiral construction technique today. There are others out there that I can talk about. If you are interested in hearing about some of those other techniques, like designing for no-sew patterns or using short rows, that sort of thing, let me know by hitting the like button and maybe we turn this into a series. All right, so we're going to start by gathering all of the tools and materials that you're going to need throughout this whole process, and you will thank yourself later if you put the time in finding them all now. All right, so to start with, you're going to need a notebook or a sketchbook and some pencils and pens, or the digital equivalent. A tablet would work fine, as well as a ruler. Now, my notebook is just an A4 standard notebook with some lines on it. You can use plain paper as well, doesn't really matter. So you're also going to need your 3.5mm hook, a pair of scissors, some pins and needles, your stuffing, and some yarn. Now, even if you want to use specialty yarn in the creation of your finished piece, you're going to want to use a yarn that doesn't frizz or tangle, because you need to allow for the fact that you might need to frog a number of times, which just is unraveling your work. You know why they call it frogging? It's because you rip it. In my experience as well, cotton tends to unravel and basically like untwist itself with too much frogging, which is why I prefer to use acrylic. Basically, I'm banning you from using natural fibers during this process. I found that carnival yarn as well as Four Seasons Marvel are both solid basics to be designing with. I found that it holds up very nicely and doesn't frizz up or tangle with itself when I do need to unravel a lot. So find a yarn that does that for you. Now, depending on what you're creating, you'll also potentially need some safety eyes, but do keep in mind that if you are intending to design for young children, these are a safety concern. They can pull out, they can be a choking hazard. You should consider sewing eyes on instead, just as a matter of safety. And now we move on to the steps. So the very first thing that we need to work on is, what does your idea look like? If you're watching this, you might already have an idea. If you don't, I suggest picking something like a bear or a bunny. There are a million iterations of them out there, but they are nice basic shapes that you can put your own spin on fairly easily. Today, I'm going to be doing a hippo. So once you know what animal you want to make, the next step is working out exactly what your idea looks like. So the first thing that you should be doing is pull up some research or reference images of your animal, and basically you should be tracing or sketching or doodling until you have a really clear image of exactly what you want your finished creature to look like. I think this step stumps a lot of people because they think they can't draw, or they actually can't draw. But all you really need to know is what your idea looks like. Basically, you don't have to be a spectacular artist for this step in the process to work. And to illustrate my point here, my partner actually volunteered to draw my initial concept for me today, and he did so good. So you can see here that he traced the original hippo literally by putting his phone underneath the paper, and then he kind of just drew and redrew the different pieces of it until he knew what he wanted his hippo to look like. So I'm going to use this as my basis, and I'm going to draw a finalized version of the creature that I'm going to make. So you really just need two main pictures. You need to know exactly what your creature looks like from the side, and you need to know exactly what it looks like from the front. You can also do the top, the back, and under if those are relevant. So as you can see, that is a very rough process of how I reached my side, front, and top views based on the original sketches by my partner. And you can see how messy they are, how scribbly they are, and how I just went over them with a black outline afterwards to kind of define exactly what I wanted the shape to be. So I'm assuming anybody watching this has made amigurumi before. So no-sew patterns do exist, but the vast majority of designs are made up of individual pieces. So pumpkin turtle here is a little model. We've got a head piece, we've got the leg pieces all separate. The pumpkin was a separate piece, tail, belly. You need to break things down into the different pieces we need to make. So the next step in this process is breaking it down into pieces. So what I'm going to be doing is drawing those pieces out like a little checklist. So I'm going to just enjoy the chaos as it unfolds on my notepaper, by the way. Now, you're going to want to draw these out at a reasonable size, okay? Not too small. Now, the first piece you're going to look for is the head / the head and the body. A lot of the time, your head and body will just be one piece. So I do want to say that there is a case for splitting the head and body piece. Basically, as a rule of thumb, if your creature has a neck, you might need to do your head and body as separate pieces. So for example, if you were working on a pony, the head and the body don't naturally make up one piece. There's a pretty clear definition where there is a neck. If your creature has no neck, you can probably get away with doing all one piece. So for my hippo, I can see that there is one continuous shape forming the head and the body. That looks basically like that. I think I added a lot of weight to my hippo just then, but basically that's what that looks like. So we've got our head and body piece. Once again, I'm going to go over it just to really define where the edge of that line is. So what else can I see? I can see that he has two little ears, which are kind of this shape. So we need two of those. And I can see he has 4 feet, which are kind of just these little shovel shapes. And I can also see there is a tail, which I've drawn as like this little rectangle, triangle type shape with a tuft at the end. So those are the pieces that I need for my hippo. All right, so now comes a time when you have to decide what order you're going to be making your pieces in. Your first piece should be the largest, most complicated piece. The reason we do that is because a lot of the time things like legs and ears and tails are just really basic, simple tubes that are very easy to adjust the sizing of just by adding rows. Whereas your head and your body, you might have to be a little bit more specific. You might have a little bit more sculpting in mind or a little bit more shaping in mind, and it's a lot harder to resize that to match a tube if you've already made the legs. Plus, if you make the head first, you can put eyes on it and then it can sit on the shelf and judge you until you finish it. And you'll be surprised how motivating that is. So I've decided that my head and body piece will be first, my legs will be second, my ears will be third, and my tail is fourth. So next up, we're going to work out where the starting point on each of our pieces is. So I'm going to start with my head and body piece, which is just one large potato. So I'm going to use my top-down view to best illustrate what we're going to do next. And that is, draw a line down the middle of your piece such that it looks the same on both sides. It should be the longest point from one side to the other of your creature. So just like that. So what this line represents is the direction we're going to work our rows in. And one end of that line will be our starting point and one end will be our finishing point. If you're doing the head and body as one piece, I always recommend starting at the head end, so it should be either the tip of the nose as shown on the hippo or the top of the head as shown on this little bunny, and that way we're finishing at the butt. Particularly if you're going to be using clip-on safety eyes, because it's a whole lot easier to clip them on at the start of the process than it is to work out the whole way up from the butt and then try and clip them on through the nose. So that's good. We know our starting point. And I recommend just marking that on your piece. It's just for your reference. And you can do the same for each of the other pieces as well. So the legs are another great example of how we approach this. So I will draw the line of symmetry again. So with the leg, we actually have a little bit of extra information as well. We know that the top part of the leg is open and the bottom part of the leg is closed. Now that tells me that the starting point is going to be here, because you always work from a closed side through to an open side on a piece like this. So I know each of my feet will be started at the bottom and then worked up as a basic tube. And I'm just going to do the same thing for my other two pieces. So we're not quite done with this stage yet. The last thing we're going to work out is how big we want each of these pieces to be. And one thing that I have learned over time is that 8-ply acrylic, that using a 3.5mm hook, roughly 2 stitches equals 1 centimeter. However, we're going to go long ways this time. So for this, you're going to grab the yarn you're going to use in your designing, and you're going to grab your hook, and we're going to work up a little swatch. All right, so to work up a swatch for this purpose, first thing you do is chain 11. Just like that. Then turn, and starting in the second chain from your hook, you're going to put 10 single crochet across the piece. Now, one thing I will caution is that if you normally yarn over, make sure you yarn over during your swatch. If you normally yarn under during your swatch. It does make an impact on the size of your finished piece. I personally prefer to yarn under. That's because I think it gives me nicer, tighter stitches, and also seems to have corrected the fact that I apparently crochet inside out, which is just really a mystery for another day. So then what you're going to basically do is work 9 more rows of single crochet until you should have a little square or rectangle worked up. So there we go. That is my little 10 by 10 swatch, and it's 10 rows tall, and we do not include the foundation chain as one of the rows. So it's 10 rows of single crochet tall and it's 10 single crochet wide. And what we can do with this little swatch is taking our ruler, measure it. So measuring the width of it, I know that 10 single crochet in this yarn with this hook, so this will be a bit different for each of you, equals 5 centimeters. And forgive me, my imperial brothers and sisters, I'm metric. I'm going to be working in metric today. The process applies to inches as well, if that's what floats your boat. And then I'm going to measure how tall it is. I've just rotated my swatch for that, and it's 5 centimeters as well. So 10 single crochet equals 5 centimeters, but 10 rows also equals 5 centimeters. And what we can do here is use this little conversion to work out how many rows and stitches around you want your creature to be. So say I want my hippo to be 10 centimeters long. In terms of converting these numbers to your creature, what you should know is rows is referring to the length along that line of symmetry you drew. So this equals sort of long. And for bunny, that would be tall. And then the number of stitches is referring to how wide around you want them to be at different points. So a lot of these numbers will potentially change as you stitch up your creature, but it's really good to have a solid foundation as to how big you expect it to be so that things don't get out of hand quickly. So if I want my hippo to only be 5 centimeters long, I have 10 rows with which to build his shape up. If I want him to be 10 centimeters, that's just going to times this by 2 and times this by 2, which means that for 10 centimeters long, he needs to be 20 rows long. And that is the power of swatching your yarn first. So I actually think 10 centimeters is a really good length for the miniature project that I have in mind today. So I'm just going to make a note here that I want this to be 20 rows, plus however many rows it takes to form the base. So I know how long I want my main nugget to be. I want to work out the size of my legs next. So what I'm going to do is take my main concept sketch and I'm just going to measure the legs in proportion to the body. So the legs are about 1 centimeter tall, according to my concept sketch here. And my main hippo is 6 centimeters long. So the calculation we do to work that out is we take the number of rows long we've decided our body should be, which is 20. We divide it by the length of our sketch, which is 6 centimeters. And then we times that by the height of our leg in the sketch, which is 1 centimeter, which comes out at 3.33 rows. So basically we should make our legs 3 to 4 rows tall. Same process with the tail. I know that the tail is about the same size as the leg, and those ears are teeny tiny, so there'll be 3 rows. And just like that, you're starting to sort of build up a picture of how big your creature will be. So basically you should go through and loosely decide how big you want things to be. So these will be guides for you, but will probably fluctuate as you start making your project. So the one last thing I'm going to do before we move off this step, I'm going to take my pen and my ruler, and then along that line of symmetry, we're going to slice it into 20 rows. I did end up slicing up my side view instead, just because it gave me a better idea of the shape. So there are my pieces all sliced up. So each one of these slices represents a row of stitches. We are now ready to start stitching. Okay, so next up we're going to set up our notes. So I prefer to work with the pen and paper, but you can do it digitally as well. We are going to keep these notes at our side and add to them after every row of stitching. So we're going to start our page off by writing what we're designing at the top of the page. So for me, that is hippo. I'm going to make a note of the hook size that I'm using, which is a 3.5 millimeter. So I'm going to write down what yarn I'm using, and for that you should include the brand, color, weight, and if you're feeling really particular, the starting weight of the ball. So we can use that to work out exactly how much yarn goes into your pattern at the end. If you're using safety eyes, you should also write down what size. So next to that, we're going to make a little stitches glossary, where as you go, you can add to this and just make a note of what stitches you use throughout the project. So for example, I can add single crochet straight away, and my shorthand for it is SC. So you can then rule that top section off. That's kind of just your heading. And below that, I'm going to add the title of the first piece we're going to be working on for the hippo, which is, for me, a head and body piece. For you, it might just be the head piece. So we are now ready to get started. Grab your yarn and your hook. So for your first row, there isn't really a wrong way to do this, but I'm going to teach you my favorite way. So this is one of those things where I'm going to be really specific, but you can change this to suit what you're making. So the way that I start the majority of my creations is with a magic ring with 6 single crochet in it. Just like that. So I've stitched that row. I'm going to pop that down and we're going to add it straight away to our notes. So row 1, I personally abbreviate magic ring for my notes as MR6. And then over here, I add the total number of stitches. And depending on how you like to work, you might want to add a stitch marker to the last stitch in your row. I just think this is a good habit to get into when you're first starting designing. You will move this marker at the end of each row just to help you track where it is. Next up, we're going to work up what I think of as the base of the piece. So the base is the flat bit, usually comprised of 1 to 3 rows at the start of each piece that we use to build up to our intended width. So basically it is the top of the head, or the tip of the nose, or the sole of the foot. Alright, so an example of this is our bunny here. And the base of this piece is this top part of the head, which you can see worked pretty flat. And basically you should work out what shape you want this to be. Round is the easiest. Basically, in each row you evenly space 6 increases out with single crochets in between. You can also have a square base, which is created by evenly spacing 4 groups of increases with single crochets in between. Or you can go for something a little bit different and go for a triangle base, which is created by evenly spacing 3 pairs of increases with single crochets in between to build up those corners. So basically what you want to do is evenly add 6 increases, or 4 if you're doing a square base, per row until our base is the size of either the top of the head or the width of the nose. So because the tip of my nose is more of an oval shape, what I'll be doing is basically working up a square. So there's my first 3 rows. It should be sitting still very flat at this point because it is just sort of the end of our piece. And note that I've recorded each row as I've done it as well. And I've added increases to the stitch glossary at the top, including the abbreviation that I used, which I use INC. So now that we have our base sorted, we want to be building up the rest of the shape. And we're going to do that one slice at a time, using the lines we drew on the diagram as a guide for what the next slice should be. All you really need to know for this is that where you put an increase, you're making your piece wider, and where you put a decrease, you're making your piece narrower. So if you evenly space increases in a round, you'll find the shape grows evenly wider. And if you put all of your increases next to each other, you will end up with a bulge on one side, with the rest just getting taller. So you can use this to create ridiculously complex shapes, but in the interest of keeping this basic, here is a simple cheat sheet. So basically, if you need your piece to be wider but not taller, evenly place 6 increases around the edge of your piece. If you need your piece to be taller but not wider, single crochet in each stitch around. If you need it to be both wider and taller, evenly place 1 to 5 increases with single crochet in between. The number of increases will impact how wide the row gets. If you need it to be narrower and taller, evenly place 1 to 5 decreases with single crochet in between. The number of decreases will impact how narrow the row gets. If you need it to be narrower but not taller, evenly place 6 decreases with single crochet in between. So pulling our base back over here now, this represents our starting point. And what you should do is look at the piece you have, which is just a flat line, and look at your first slice. Basically, from here, you need to work out what you need to do to this to get it to that slice, and refer to the cheat sheet on the screen to help you out. So for me personally, I can see that I don't need this piece to be wider for this first slice only, but what I do need is for it to be taller, or longer as it were, because my piece is flat. So what I'm going to be doing is, as it says in the cheat sheet, is add a single crochet to each of the stitches around. Like so. Adding that to my notes, and I'm going to color in the slice on my diagram so that I know which one I'm up to. So I'm now just going to work through the rest of the slices of the hippo. I'll include on the screen a picture of the slice and details as to what I did to make it happen. So there is my head and body piece, eyes snapped on. I have stuffed it and made notes here. That, for example, it says here that my eyes go in row 10. I've counted backwards from the nose to measure that. And I also made a note around my row 20 because that is when I did the bulk of the stuffing. So those are 2 important notes as well for you to include here. So my slices have brought me down to a finished piece with just a very small gap left at the back of them. But if you still have an opening in your creation, work rounds with 6 evenly spaced decreases in them until you're down to about 6 stitches, just to close off the back of the piece. You can then finish off like I just have. And to close off this last tiny little gap, I'm going to weave that remaining tail through each of those 6 stitches, like so, and pull it tight like a drawstring bag to close, and weave that end in. So that should be your first piece done. Now you basically just need to repeat that process to make up the rest of your pieces. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've made all of those pieces, and that means I've made 4 legs and 2 ears. Now, one of the early edits I've already made is I've decided not to include the tail. So with that, we're going to move on to step 9, which is assembling the pieces. Now, assembly instructions are just as important as the stitch instructions when you're telling somebody how to make your creature. So to start with, I'm just going to pin all of my pieces roughly where I think they should be. Just like that. So now that I've done that, what I need to do is include notes in my pattern to communicate to somebody else on where to put those pieces. So what I would do is, starting from my starting point, I would count back the number of rows until I reach where the ears are lined up, first of all. So I can tell you that they are in row 13. And I can also say that the inner edge of the ear should be lined up with the top edge of each of the plastic safety eyes. So with those 2 points of reference, somebody else should be able to position their ears exactly where I've put mine. And I would do a similar thing for the legs underneath. And now, of course, all there is to do is sew your pieces on. Just like that. So now you have a finished version of your creature in front of you. We're going to look at step 10, which is reviewing your creature. So you should consider this little guy your first draft of your pattern. So you should compare your creature to your original sketches and just see if there's anything that you would like to do differently. So a couple of changes that I wanted to make with my hippo were I wanted to add nostrils to him, stitch those in as I went. I thought he came out a little shorter in the body than I would like, and so I added a couple of rows to beef him up a little bit. And I also lengthened his front legs so that he can balance a little bit better. So you should go through this same process with your creature as well. All right, so at this point, where you're happy with the final form of your creature, what we're going to do is finalize our notes. So grabbing our ruler, we're going to measure your finished creature and make a note of the height, length, and width. If you weighed your yarn at the start, what you do is weigh your yarn again now, and for each color, subtract your current yarn weight from your starting yarn weight. And then you'll have the exact right number of grams that you used in this pattern. And you should make a note of that as well. Ensure that you have written notes for each of the pieces. I have my head and body, I have my feet and my ears. And then depending on your intentions for this pattern, you should either take the time to type them up or rewrite them neatly for clarity while they're still fresh in your mind. So next up, we're going to test our own pattern. Now, this is something that you might be better off leaving until the next day when it's not so fresh in your mind. So basically what you want to do is carefully follow each line of your notes and stitch a second version of your design. If it doesn't come out exactly the same as your first version, you need to correct your notes. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but if you have to change your notes after you've done a test, then you actually need to test again. However, you can just retest the piece that had the changes on it. You don't need to necessarily make the whole thing again every single time. So then you can choose to make a final version. And this is where you can introduce things like specialty yarns if you really want to. There should be little to no frogging when creating this final piece, so using some of the more temperamental fibers is more okay at this end of the process. Now, if you're wanting to sell copies of your pattern, you should be taking lots of nice clear photos to demonstrate the steps during this part of the process. Also, if you're going to sell, it's a really good idea to get other people who crochet to test your pattern as well. So there you should have your finished design and your finished pattern. Now, this is normally not a one-day process. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope anybody who made it to this point in the video learned something. Now, if you want more information on any of the subjects that I've covered in this video, leave me a question down in the comments and I'll see if we need to do a part 2. But other than that, I will see you next week where I'll be kicking off hopefully some Halloween patterns. All right, bye.